It was somewhere in Normandy. July 1944, the hedgerows were thick, the air smelled of smoke and wet earth, and crawling through the undergrowth alone was a 19-year-old soldier clutching a weapon his own comrades had nicknamed the stovepipe, the drainpipe. Some called it, with barely concealed contempt, the dustbin gun. Ahead of him, a German tank. The ground shook under its weight. The engine growled like something prehistoric. And this soldier, this teenager, had to close the distance to less than 100 yards before he could even think about pulling the trigger. In the German army, soldiers who had seen this weapon captured and examined it had laughed. Their engineers had passed it around with amusement. This is what the British are using. They weren't laughing now, because that awkward, ugly, almost comical contraption was about to do something no one least of all its enemies fully expected. This is the story of the PIAT, Britain's most mocked weapon, and one of the most effective killing tools of the entire Second World War. To understand why the PIAT existed at all, you need to understand just how badly the British Army was losing the anti-tank war. By 1941, when Germany invaded France in May of 1940, the Wehrmacht's armored formations shattered Allied defensive lines with a speed and violence that stunned the world. Blitzkrieg wasn't magic. It was combined arms warfare executed with ruthless precision. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft working together in devastating coordination. The British Expeditionary Force that escaped at Dunkirk left behind almost all of its heavy equipment, and what it had left wasn't particularly reassuring. The boys' anti-tank rifle, a heavy, bolt-action weapon firing a .55 caliber round, had been the British infantryman's primary anti-tank option. By the time of Dunkirk, it was already struggling to penetrate the frontal armor of German medium tanks. Against the newer Panzer III and IV variants arriving in North Africa, it was practically useless. Britain needed something new, something powerful enough to threaten German armor, light enough for an infantry section to carry, and manufacturable in the tens of thousands within months. That requirement landed, quietly and unofficially, in the hands of a man named Major Millis Jefferies. Jefferies ran a small, secretive department called MD1, officially the Ministry of Defense 1, unofficially known as Churchill's Toy Shop. It was a workshop of mavericks, engineers, and inventors who operated outside normal military bureaucracy, with Winston Churchill's personal blessing. Their mandate was simple: invent things that work, do it fast, don't ask permission. Jefferies and his team looked at an older concept, the spigot mortar, and began reimagining it as an infantry anti-tank weapon. The principle was elegant in theory. A powerful spring would launch a finned bomb forward. The bomb's shaped charge would focus its explosive energy into a narrow, penetrating jet upon impact, what engineers call the Monroe effect, capable of burning through tank armor. No propellant gas, no dangerous backblast, almost no visible flash or smoke. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was a nightmare to use. The first thing soldiers noticed about the PIAT was that it looked wrong. It was 39 inches long. It weighed nearly 35 pounds fully loaded. It had no conventional trigger in the traditional sense. Instead, a shoulder pad, a large central tube, and a monopod that folded down underneath it. It fired a bomb that looked more like a small metal pineapple with fins than a precision munition. To cock it to compress the massive internal spring before firing, the operator had to perform a maneuver that bordered on absurdity. Lying on their back, both feet braced against the weapon's shoulder rest, both hands gripping the body, they would heave with everything they had. The force required was later officially measured at roughly 200 pounds. 200 pounds of force every single time. If the weapon misfired, and it sometimes did, the soldier had to repeat this process in the middle of a firefight, often while an armored vehicle was close enough to feel the ground shaking. Small wonder that soldiers had opinions about it. A nasty-tempered brute, one British sergeant reportedly called it. Half the time you weren't sure if it was going to kill them or you. But complaints aside, the weapon was issued in 1942, and it went immediately to war. The PIAT's first serious combat came in the deserts of North Africa, where the 8th Army was grinding through the brutal Seesaw campaign against Rommel's Afrika Korps. Here, at distances that made the PIAT's 100-yard effective range feel uncomfortably intimate, soldiers began discovering something unexpected. The weapon worked. Its shaped charge could penetrate the armor of Italian M1340 tanks and earlier Panzer variants with relative consistency. More importantly, its lack of backblast and muzzle signature made it far harder for enemy crews to locate the firer than the American-supplied bazookas, which produced a distinct blast signature. In the narrow streets and rubble of North African towns and villages, a soldier with a PIAT could disappear into cover, fire, and vanish before the enemy could respond. This was not a perfect weapon. Its maximum effective range was barely 100 yards. Against heavily armored targets, it needed a clean hit at the right angle. And in open desert terrain, getting within 100 yards of a tank that was actively trying to kill you required either extraordinary cunning or extraordinary courage. Usually both. By 1943, the Allies had landed in Sicily and then mainland Italy. The Italian campaign would prove to be one of the most physically punishing theaters of the war, a slow, brutal slog northward through mountainous terrain, fortified towns, river crossings, and determined German defense. And in Italy, the PIAT found its home. Urban warfare, close quarters, narrow streets where tanks couldn't maneuver easily, stone buildings that German forces converted into machine gun nests, mortar positions, and strongpoints. In this environment, the PIAT's unique characteristics became genuine advantages. Its trajectory allowed it to be fired from inside buildings, through windows, around corners, because it produced no dangerous backblast. A soldier could fire from an enclosed space without killing himself. The Germans noticed this with alarm. Their own Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, while powerful, produced backblasts that made confined space firing dangerous or impossible. British and Commonwealth soldiers with PIATs were appearing inside buildings, firing downward onto tank engine decks, lobbing rounds around corners. It became something considerably less laughable. Now we arrive at the heart of this story, because what elevated the PIAT from interesting military footnote to genuine legend was not its design, or its production numbers, or even its tactical versatility. It was the men who used it. The PIAT earned directly or significantly contributed to more Victoria Crosses than almost any other individual infantry weapon in the British and Commonwealth forces during World War II. Consider what this means. The Victoria Cross is awarded for acts of valor in the face of the enemy that go beyond all normal expectation of duty. It is, deliberately and explicitly, reserved for the extraordinary. And yet, again and again, soldiers with PIATs were performing acts of valor so far beyond ordinary human courage that the highest honor available could barely contain them. Italy, May 16, 1944. The Garigliano River Valley. The Allied advance had stalled against ferocious German defensive positions in the mountains. Fusilier Francis Jefferson of the Lancashire Fusiliers found himself in a situation that no amount of training fully prepares a man for. 2 German tanks Mark IV Panzers had broken through and were advancing directly toward his company's position, followed by infantry. If they reached the British line, the position would collapse. Jefferson picked up a PIAT. He ran forward alone, not crawling, running, across open ground under fire toward 2 tanks. He got close enough, he fired. He hit the lead tank, which immediately stopped the crew bailing out in panic. The second tank, confronted with this baffling and terrifying act of individual aggression, reversed and withdrew. The German infantry attack, deprived of armored support, faltered and broke. Jefferson received the Victoria Cross. He was 22 years old. But perhaps no PIAT action in the entire war matched what happened in September 1944 at the Bridge of Arnhem. Operation Market Garden. Field Marshal Montgomery's ambitious attempt to use massed airborne forces to seize a series of bridges across the Netherlands outflank the Siegfried Line, and potentially end the war before Christmas. It was, in the words of one commander, a bridge too far. The British 1st Airborne Division landed near Arnhem and fought its way toward the Great Bridge over the Rhine. One battalion led by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost actually reached the bridge's northern end and held it, but they were cut off, surrounded, and the Germans were bringing up heavy armor to destroy them. The bridge was the key to everything. In the darkness of the first night, September 17th into the 18th, a small group of paratroopers held the northern ramp of the bridge against repeated German attempts to force a crossing. Among them was a soldier armed with a PIAT. When a column of German armored vehicles, half-tracks, and armored cars attempted to rush the bridge in the darkness, this small group opened fire. The PIAT operator engaged the lead vehicle at extremely close range. It was destroyed. The column halted. Chaos ensued among the German vehicles. 6 German vehicles were destroyed in that action, 6 at a bridge ramp in the dark. The PIAT operator, who played a central role in that action, received the Victoria Cross. His name was Lance Sergeant John Baskerville. He was 21 years old, he was already wounded, and he kept firing until he was killed. But the bridge held for another day. D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Among the equipment landing on those beaches and in those gliders was, of course, the PIAT, thousands of them, carried by paratroopers, commandos, infantry sections, and airborne units. The weeks that followed the Battle of the Normandy bocage produced some of the most difficult fighting of the Western Front. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the bocage, was a nightmare for armor and infantry alike. Ancient earthen banks, topped with dense hedgerows, divided the landscape into a labyrinth of tiny fields and sunken lanes. Tanks couldn't see, infantry couldn't advance without exposing themselves. And into this labyrinth, German Tiger tanks appeared. The Tiger I, 57 tons of steel, armed with the devastating 88mm gun, was essentially impervious to most Allied tank guns at normal engagement ranges. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Allied tank crews called it Tiger Fear. Junior officers had to actively suppress panic in their men when word spread that Tigers were nearby. A PIAT could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. The men carrying them knew this, and yet. In the bocage, the Tiger's greatest weakness was its inability to maneuver in the confined lanes. A Tiger in a hedgerow lane was limited in where it could point its gun. A soldier with a PIAT, crawling through a ditch, could approach from the flank, could aim for the thinner side armor, could fire from close enough that the shot geometry changed everything. Several PIATs were used against Tigers in the bocage with success. Not easily, not without extraordinary risk, but with success. Every Tiger knocked out by whatever means had an outsized effect on German morale and operational tempo. The PIAT contributed to that cumulative weight. There was something specific that veterans described about the sound the PIAT made when fired. It was not the crack of a rifle, not the boom of artillery. It was a distinctive, heavy thump followed immediately by the metallic shriek of the bomb in flight, and then the sharp crack of the shaped charge detonating against its target. German tank crews, in accounts collected after the war, described learning to dread that sound, because it was quiet enough that they often didn't hear it until the bomb was already in the air, and because, unlike a bazooka round which streaked visibly across the battlefield, the PIAT bomb was harder to track. You would hear the thump, one German panzer crewman recalled in a post-war interview, and then you were already checking whether you were still alive. This psychological dimension of the PIAT, the anxiety it introduced into German armored operations in built-up areas, is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Less commonly discussed is the PIAT's use in the Pacific Theater, where Commonwealth forces, primarily Australian, Indian, and British units, brought the weapon into the jungles of Burma, New Guinea, and Southeast Asia. Here against Japanese fortifications, bunkers, pillboxes, and entrenched positions, the PIAT functioned essentially as a direct-fire mortar. Its bomb, detonating against a concrete or log emplacement, created a focused blast that could collapse structures or kill occupants with concussive force, even without direct penetration. In this role, the PIAT arguably exceeded its anti-tank function. Infantry units used it to destroy fortified positions that would otherwise have required artillery or engineer demolition teams. It allowed smaller units to project destructive firepower independently, reducing casualty rates in assault operations. The jungle swallowed the PIAT's story here, as it swallowed much of the Burma campaign. But the weapons served, and served effectively, to the war's last days. The PIAT was declared obsolete almost immediately after the war ended. By 1950, it was being replaced by newer, lighter anti-tank weapons, the American-designed M20 bazooka derivatives, and eventually purpose-built rocket launchers. It had served for barely 8 years, and in those 8 years, it had participated in every major British and Commonwealth theatre of operations from North Africa to the Rhine. But here is what the production numbers reveal. Between 1942 and 1945, Britain manufactured approximately 115,000 PIATs. 115,000. This was not a limited production curiosity or a special operations tool. This was a mass-produced infantry weapon issued at section level across the entire British Army, the Commonwealth Forces, the Special Operations Executive, and even to resistance fighters in occupied Europe. Partisans in Yugoslavia and elsewhere received PIATs via airdrop and used them with considerable effect. The weapon that German engineers reportedly chuckled at in 1943 was, by 1944, killing their soldiers, destroying their armor, and collapsing their bunkers on multiple continents. And here is perhaps the most remarkable statistical footnote. Of all the Victoria Crosses awarded to British and Commonwealth forces in World War II, the Supreme Decoration for Valor, awarded only 182 times throughout the entire conflict, a disproportionate number, were directly connected to PIAT actions. The precise number depends on how one categorizes the circumstances, but historians generally identify at least 7 Victoria Crosses where the PIAT was the central instrument of the act being recognized. 7 Victoria Crosses for a weapon they called a dustbin. What does this tell us? It tells us that the PIAT demanded a specific kind of soldier, not a soldier who could fire from safety, not a soldier who could engage at long range. The PIAT required a soldier who would close the distance, who would get close enough to hear the tank's engine, who would aim at a vehicle that could crush him without noticing and fire with steady hands. The weapon's limitations became a crucible. Only the genuinely brave could use it effectively, and when they did, the results were often decisive. Millis Jefferies, the eccentric engineer who oversaw the PIAT's development, never received the recognition his work perhaps deserved. He worked largely in secrecy, operated outside the normal channels of military procurement, and was viewed with some suspicion by the military establishment.